Okay, so let's get started. We're talking about substantial damage, and substantial damage is um, one of the most important aspects of your job as a floodplain administrator. But this class goes a little bit beyond that. So we're going to talk about some things that you can do before a disaster event, and we'll talk about the during a disaster responsibilities, which of course you need to be aware of. Um, and then also well after. So we're going to cover the entire process, but specifically we'll do it in the scope of floodplain management, which is what you all need. So in the agenda, this kind of lays out what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about substantial damage and what it actually is. We'll explain how it's defined, where you can find it in regulations and what it means for you. We're actually going to go through the substantial damage assessment process, which is more than just your site inspection. There's actually an entire process that you should follow in order to do the entire thing correctly. And then once we've talked about your substantial damage assessments and that process, you're probably going to be somewhat overwhelmed. And so what we'll do then is we'll go down the route of preparedness. How can you better prepare for this seemingly overwhelming substantial damage assessment process? We'll open up the SDE 3.0 tool, and we'll show you what that looks like. Depending on the amount of time, we might even be able to do an entry. Then we'll finish off by talking about substantial improvement and how that relates to substantial damage and what the differences are. And of course, we will share resources at the end and throughout. So let's start off. Let's talk about substantial damage and what it actually is. So substantial damage. We are talking about the fact that repairs or additions to your existing structures in the floodplain it's considered development. And for those of you that have attended our basic floodplain management class know that any development in the floodplain requires a floodplain development permit. So when someone is doing repair work or improving upon an existing structure in the floodplain, in any case, they have to get a floodplain development permit. Now, this is a relatively easy thing to do if the structure is already compliant with your regulations. So maybe you permitted this house to be built in your floodplain and you require them to elevate the lowest floor 1 foot above the base flood elevation. They can do repairs or additions to that structure as long as it doesn't make it non-conforming. So that's relatively easy to do. But we all know that that's not always the case. Most of the structures, or at least some of the structures in your community that are in the floodplain, existed prior to your community joining the National Flood Insurance Program or having a floodplain map within which to regulate. So in that case, where you have a structure that was pre-existing and is grandfathered, what is the process for that when they need repairs? Well, under the NFIP, and this is the same concept for grandfathering for any type of zoning regulation or what have you, but you have to have some sort of grandfather clause, which says that this structure can exist as is until a certain set of conditions are met. It's no different in the NFIP. If you have a non-conforming structure that is substantially improved or substantially damaged, it has to be brought into compliance with the floodplain ordinance. So what that means for you is that when a disaster occurs and you have damaged structures in your floodplain, it is your responsibility, it is the local community's responsibility to determine if those structures have incurred substantial damage or not. And you have to do that before issuing permits to repair. And this is called the substantial damage assessment process. Now, Nebraska establishes substantial damage as being 50% of the structure's market value. Now, that is in line with the federal standard under the NFIP. They have the same threshold. So Nebraska doesn't go above that. But you'll find it in our Nebraska Administrative Code, Title 455, Chapter 1, Paragraph 002.21, where it defines substantial damage. And what it means is damage of any origin sustained by an obstruction. And don't let the word obstruction throw you off. Obstruction means the same as development. It's just the way Nebraska defined it. So any damage of any origin sustained by an obstruction whereby the cost of restoring the obstruction to its before damaged condition would equal or exceed 50% of the market value of the obstruction before the damage occurred. So you're comparing the cost to restore the structure to its pre-damage market value. Now, just because Nebraska has that 50% threshold does not mean that your community has to adhere just to that. You can adopt a lower threshold than 50%. And what that would mean is that it would take less damage for a structure to achieve substantial damage and have to be brought into compliance. So that is, check your floodplain regulations to see if you have a lower threshold. Same can go for cumulative cost tracking. So under normal circumstances, substantial damage is just based on an event or repairs to an event. But if you have structures in your community that routinely have flood losses or repeatedly have damages that are lower than the 50% threshold, and you're just repeating that disaster cycle on that property and constantly investing resources in bringing it back to its pre-existing condition, you might have a look at tracking those costs over time cumulatively. So maybe one year they incur 25% damage, the next year they incur 30% damage, and they've now exceeded the 50% over the course of 2 years. You can set that time period for cumulative cost tracking to whatever you're liking. So have a look at your floodplain regulations. If it's not something that you have and you're interested in, feel free to reach out to our team and we can help you build it into your regulations to start enforcing that way. So what does this mean as the floodplain administrator? Well, just think about in a disaster situation, the mentality that people have, the state of mind people are going to be in. We all know here in Nebraska, as soon as you have a disaster, people are out helping and they're starting to rebuild almost immediately after the event occurs. Keep that in mind. After a disaster, people will want to start repairs on their structure as soon as possible. The problem is, if you have a building that's in the floodplain, they need to get a floodplain development permit before those repairs can start. The other problem is, if the building is substantially damaged, they can't just rebuild back the way it was. They have to build the structure back into compliance with your regulations. So you have to make sure that you get that messaging out ahead of time in advance so that people are aware of the procedures should an event happen in your community. Now, why is this process necessary? And this is a question that we all have to ask and understand why we're doing this in the first place. Um, the first thing that I like to point out is kind of the obvious one. It is established in federal and state law. So the Code of Federal Regulations under the National Flood Insurance Program do require substantial damage estimations to be made by the floodplain administrator. That's part of the program. It's part of the NFIP. And as we talked about, Nebraska's administrative code is no different. So just from the top down standpoint, yes, it is federal and state law to do this process. However, thinking about it from the bigger picture, what is that actually achieving? Why is it the law? Well, the idea behind it is that you have to reduce the number of flood-prone structures in your community. And you can't just do that by enacting a new floodplain ordinance and suddenly everybody has to be brought into compliance. You have to have those triggers. You have to have something that sets that process off. And this is that process. And when you have structures that incur substantial damage, the idea is that you are making your community more resilient for next time. You are reducing your risk over time, bringing those structures into compliance, bringing them to safety, mitigating them from the next event. Beyond that, and even more important to the individual property owner, is that you can protect future buyers of those flood-prone properties. So we've seen it a number of times where people have homes that are substantially damaged by flooding, and rather than fix up the property, they would rather just sell it and be rid of it. And unfortunately, people who are unsuspecting or unaware purchase that property thinking that they have a cheap home that they can flip, come to find out the entire structure is currently non-conforming and has to be brought into compliance. So your records that you maintain can protect those unsuspecting buyers. And if you're not careful, you might end up with a situation where a new owner has that burden of bringing the structure into compliance without their knowledge. Additionally, it doesn't stop there. So if you have homeowners in your community that are NFIP insured, so they have an NFIP flood insurance policy on their property, and they experience substantial damage due to flooding, they can receive up to $30,000 on top of their flood insurance claim to help them bring it into compliance. And that can go a long way. This is called increased cost of compliance coverage, and it's an automatic rider with any NFIP policy. And it's part of the reason why we push NFIP flood insurance so hard, is that if you have a non-conforming structure in your community that is substantially damaged by flooding, if they are insured, they can get an additional 30,000 to help them bring it into compliance, to a maximum of 250,000 in total claims. And the last point I'd like to make is that structures that do incur substantial damage also qualify for hazard mitigation grant funding to help them elevate or relocate to mitigate their structures. And substantially damaged structures automatically are considered to meet benefit cost analysis requirements for hazard mitigation assistance grants. So to give you a real world example, this last year, we had enough flooding events to qualify for what's called FMA Swift Current, where Nebraska was allocated $10 million to disperse across the state to individuals who qualified for the funding to bring their structures into compliance using grant funding. Many of these projects were 75% federally funded and 25% locally, but some of them were up to 100% federally funded. So please be aware that your documentation through the substantial damage process can not only help you with compliance with the NFIP, but goes a long way to helping the property owners in your community. All right, so we're going to start off by talking about the entire substantial damage assessment process. And it's going to be a lot. I'm just going to tell you that now. It's going to be a lot of information. However, remember that after we talk about all of this, we'll talk about some things you can do, some steps you can take to prepare for this in advance, so it's not so overwhelming. But the substantial damage assessment process is not just doing the site inspection. There is an entire step-by-step process that we recommend that you follow. So, step one, we recommend that you start by doing an office review and your field work preparations. And what that means is just before you even leave your office, what do you need to bring with you? I need clipboards, I need worksheets, maybe a hard hat, I need my badge, my ID. If I have credentials so I can get onto the disaster site and check in with my emergency manager, can I bring that badge? So just thinking about before you leave, what do you need before you take off from your office? So the next step is actually what's called a curbside review. The point of the curbside review is to narrow down the scope and to narrow down the number of full inspections you need to complete. And what that means is you're driving through the disaster area, determining where the disaster impacted, how many damaged structures do you have, about how many inspections do you think you're going to have to do? Do you need volunteers? Do you need help? What's the schedule going to look like? How long is it going to take? In the event of a flood, that also would mean maybe drawing the boundaries of where the flood water reached. That's just your curbside review, though. You haven't actually started doing individual property assessments quite yet. Step 3 is your actual substantial damage inspection. And what this means, what this comprises of is, first of all, developing a schedule. So if you have a ton of structures that you need to be inspecting, who's responsible for what part of town? How long is it going to take? When are we meeting back at the office by? Notify the authorities of your inspection plans. And what that means is a lot of times in a disaster site, there's going to be an incident command established for that disaster area. And the only people that will be allowed onto the site would be people that are credentialed with the local emergency manager. So make sure that you have a relationship with your emergency manager ahead of time so that you're on their list. Providing training for inspectors via pilot inspections. And what this means is that if you need help, if you're bringing inspectors along with you, volunteers, do the first few inspections together so you can all see how the process works before you split up and go do it on your own. And then, of course, conducting the substantial damage inspection. Once you've done all your inspections, you head back to your office and you process all of that field data, all of your inspection paperwork, all the photographs that you took. You're going to process everything. For each of those properties, you'll then review and issue your substantial damage determination. Is it above or below the 50% threshold? And lastly, issuing floodplain development permits to begin repairs. So, a bit of a process. We'll talk through each step in the next slides. But I want to point out, and Michelle put it in the chat as well, we have a substantial damage handbook. And these slides follow that handbook page by page. So if you're interested, you can open up, if you have two screens, you can open up the handbook and follow along. If you have a physical copy of the handbook, you can follow along, but you don't have to. I'll be showing pages as we work through it, and you can reference back to them. So okay, that office review and prerequisites. What do we mean by that? So before leaving your office, you're going to have to figure out where you think where your substantial damage regulations are going to apply. So think about the areas in the floodplain that were not affected by the disaster. Think about your damaged structures that are not in the floodplain. And think about structures that you permitted that you know are already in compliance. All three of those are not structures that you need to worry about. What you're concerned about, and you can see by this graphic on your screen here, you are looking for the structures that are in your floodplain, in your jurisdiction, that received damage and are currently non-conforming, right? Those are the structures that you, as a floodplain administrator, need to be doing your substantial damage inspections for. This is a sort of blown up, more detailed version of that same graphic. So you can see, I'm going to turn on my laser pointer just a moment. So you can see here, this blue area is the floodplain, the special flood hazard area. So imagine this blue shaded area is the floodplain. This yellow hatched area is where damage occurred. It's the disaster area. So maybe a tornado came through here, or a wildfire, what have you. This is your disaster area. And then this dotted line is your jurisdiction. And so we do have a lot of communities where their boundaries line up with the county boundary. So this might be an example, or maybe it goes through a river. So this dotted line is your jurisdiction. So you'll note that the first structure, it's in your jurisdiction, but it's not in the floodplain and wasn't damaged. So do you need to do a substantial damage assessment for that property? Not at all. The second structure right here, it was damaged. However, it's not in your floodplain. So it may need some type of disaster inspection, and likely your local emergency manager will be taking care of that as part of their disaster declaration process. But as the floodplain administrator, this is not in the floodplain. They don't need a floodplain development permit to start repairs. Structure number 3 down here, it's in the floodplain, but it didn't receive any damages, which means they don't need a permit to start repairs. They don't have any damages to repair, so they're fine. This one can be checked off eventually during the curbside review. 5 and 6 are in the disaster area. 5 is in the floodplain, but notice they're outside of your jurisdiction. They're in another jurisdiction. It's that jurisdiction's responsibility. Structure number 4 is the structure that you would be doing a substantial damage assessment for. It's a structure that's in the floodplain and was damaged and is in your jurisdiction. Any questions about that? Okay. Oops. There we go. This is the same chart, but in a decision tree, in a flow chart format. So it's the same information put into a flow chart format. Feel free to reference this if it helps you visualize things a little bit better. Okay, so once you know the area that has been impacted, we recommend immediately starting outreach. And outreach involves the public and your community leadership. So make sure your community leadership are on board with the process that you are having to undertake. They should be able to answer questions about the floodplain and explain at a basic level what substantial damage means. Now, they don't need to be an expert on floodplain management, but they should at least understand that we have a floodplain and that if your structures that are in the floodplain are damaged, they need to have a floodplain development permit and they should point back to you. So make sure your entire community leadership is on the same page. And of course, this also includes the public. And the public doesn't just mean property owners, it also means the press. So if you can do a press release to the radio, a local newspaper, other media, we recommend doing a press release. As you can see on the left side, we have an example press release in the handbook, and I've marked it's page 43. You can use that press release, plug in your information, and use it to get messages out in the event of a disaster. We recommend if you have a public information officer, make sure that they are putting out announcements and messages. They can do so through social media or interviews or what have you to explain this process. And also you can print notices to put on doors as you start to go out and do your disaster area tour. At the very least, those notices should explain the substantial damage assessment process, should explain that they need an inspection from the floodplain administrator, and then we recommend having business cards that you can staple to that notice. So as you're walking around, you can provide your contact information. The public also includes your contractors and your volunteers as well. So what do these groups need to know? Well, again, think about a disaster situation. Your volunteers are going to be coming in wanting to help start repair work as soon as possible. So make sure that these groups are also aware that you need to be doing an inspection before any repair work starts, and any repairs do need permits from your office. Let them know about the substantial damage process and requirements. A lot of this can be accomplished just by being on site and having somebody as volunteers and as contractors are checking into the disaster site. There's somebody there that can answer these questions and convey these messages. And again, this is why communicating with your leadership can go a long way to help you spread that awareness. You can also talk, it doesn't always have to be negative, of course, or it doesn't always have to be just about regulations. You can also talk about increased cost of compliance availability. Make sure that people who have incurred flood damages and have an NFIP policy are also submitting for increased cost of compliance coverage as part of their claims. Make sure they're taking those pictures and reaching out to their insurance agent. You can also caution them about unlicensed contractors and fraudulent entities that might try to take advantage of disaster victims. And this, um, it doesn't happen a lot, but in your large disaster situations where there's a lot of chaos and maybe not a very collective effort, this is something that does happen. We heard about it last year with the hurricanes that impacted the East Coast. There were a few cases of this occurring. And then this is also an opportunity to discuss the possibility of mitigating those properties that were damaged. Maybe they're not substantially damaged, but it's still a good time to maybe have that conversation so that your community is prepared for next time. And it's recommended that this information is not just shared during a disaster event or after a disaster event. Share this information on an annual basis. These messages should be out there because it is extremely hard to have that conversation with a property owner when they have just experienced a major disaster. They are going to be at probably one of the lowest points in their lives, and having that conversation about substantial damage for the very first time is going to be very difficult for them to process. So, if you can share these messages, even if it's just sharing resources that we've already produced for you, and such as social media posts or the examples that we have in the handbook, we recommend sharing this information on a regular basis so that these messages are already conveyed. Does it make the conversation easier? Maybe, maybe not, but at least the message has been put out there. Now, keep in mind that you're going to get this comment a lot. Somebody's already come by and inspected my house. That's probably very true. So, FEMA is going to be doing a rapid needs assessment if it's a big enough disaster. Any agencies such as FEMA, NEMA, the National Weather Service, local entities, emergency managers are going to be doing various forms of preliminary damage assessments. Local emergency management agencies are responsible for submitting an estimated cost of damages in the event that they can submit for a declaration to receive additional resources. So, at the very least, you're going to have the locals involved. But depending on the size of the disaster, you may also have state and federal entities also doing damage assessments. If there's public assistance that's going to be obtained, there's also going to be an assessment of public facilities. Um, you are responsible for the substantial damage assessment. So that's going to be another person coming onto their property. If they have insurance claims adjusters, or maybe contractors are coming out to scope out what kind of work they might have to do. They might have volunteer groups coming in and talking to homeowners about recovery or grants or other resources. You're going to have a lot of people on site. And so just remembering that, explaining where you come from as the floodplain administrator, this is what we're looking for. Here's how it's different from these other agencies. Or at best, if you already have that pre-established relationship with your local emergency manager, tie your inspections together so that you are doing things at the same time as a group. It just reduces the number of individual assessments that might be happening. Okay, so you've left your office. You're not necessarily doing substantial damage inspections on individual properties quite yet. At this point, we're going to start with the curbside review. During the curbside review, bring with you a camera so you can take some just preliminary pictures to figure out where the damage is occurring, the extensive damage and such. Bring your safety gear, so a high-vis vest, hard hat, gloves, boots. Always bring boots, especially after a flood. It's going to be pretty mucky out, so bring your boots. Also have your photo ID or badges. This is especially important when you're doing individual inspections, and we'll get to that in the next step. But when you're doing individual inspections, you take your badge, you flash it up to their Ring doorbell before you start your inspection. That can go a long way in terms of transparency and credibility. Bring with you radios and spare batteries, and then bring with you some educational materials. So substantial damage flyers, increased cost of compliance brochures, general National Flood Insurance Program information, something that you can hand to people if they come up to you and have questions about what you're doing. We do have a field preparations checklist in the handbook as well, so you can make sure to go through and identify which items you still need and which ones you already have, so you know what to bring with you the next time you have an event. You're going to drive through the damaged areas of the special flood hazard area. And what you need to do at this point is figure out where the limits are. This can be somewhat difficult in the event of a tornado. We all know how tornadoes can be, where one house is damaged and the next is not. But try and understand just a general area of where the disaster occurred. In the event of a flood or a tornado or a wildfire, what have you, try and bring a map with you and draw general boundaries or points of interest so that when you come back to your office, you have a general area to define your scope. In fact, during the floodplain mapping process, if we come back and talk to you about your flood history, you can then provide those past examples, those drawings of your general flood boundaries from the last event, and we can build that into part of our analysis during your floodplain mapping. Also keep in mind to record the number of structures. So you're going to note the structure types, are they residential or commercial? And the estimated levels of damage. And the idea here is you need to figure out how much capacity do we need to fill. If I have if I have 5 structures I need to inspect, maybe that's something that I myself as the floodplain administrator can handle on my own. But if you start getting into 12, 24, 50 structures, you need to start thinking about maybe building a team or having a team pre-established, but record the general number of structures so you can parse out about how much time the entire process is going to take and if you need to loop in volunteers. And document is not just about documenting the areas with damage, also document the areas with little to no apparent damage. Because those are the individuals that you can issue permits for even faster to help them begin repairs. Now they still need a substantial damage assessment, but ideally, if you can see that they have little to no apparent damage, that's an easy assessment to plug in, and you can issue their permits relatively quickly and get those out of the way. Okay, that's your curbside review process. Now we're going to get into your actual substantial damage inspection process. So you've identified the general area where this disaster occurred. You know about how many inspections need to occur. Now what? Well, come back to your office and figure out a schedule. Get everybody together in a room if you're having volunteers and come up with an agenda, a schedule to make sure everybody knows where they're responsible for and about how long it's going to take. If you bring with you a team, make sure that the first 2 inspections you do, at least the first 2, are done as a group. Make sure the entire team can see you doing a substantial damage inspection so they know what they're supposed to do. And it's not just about doing it 100% accurately every time, it's about consistently. That's the biggest point. Are you, as the floodplain administrator who's not been through the post-disaster process before, are you going to be perfectly in tune with how the substantial damage assessment process works? No, and we don't expect you to. But what we do expect you to do is be as accurate as you can and be consistent. So by having those first 2 pilot inspections done together, everybody will be on the same page and can do things consistently before they break off. Hopefully that makes sense. Substantial damage inspections. We're coming back to the actual inspections. So we first recommend creating a schedule. And you can see the graphic I have here on the right. This is just something that I threw together. It can be that simple. You take your floodplain map and you look at the area that was damaged. And then if you have a team of 3, you have 3 different teams. You can tell team 3, you're going to be on the east side of the highway. Team 2, you're going to be on the west side. Team 1, you're on the north side of the railroad. And then now you have broken up those inspections into groups to help you tackle more in an efficient manner. But in terms of creating that schedule, keep in mind that you want to start in areas where you know debris has been cleared, allowing for faster inspections. So um, in that case, you're finding in the curbside review, when you first went out and did your drive-through, you can take a look at the areas where debris removal has already started occurring, and you can kind of get an idea of where you should start. Note the areas with high development density, and what that means is not necessarily like your downtown areas, but just your areas where you have structures next to each other, where you're not having to drive in between inspections. Maybe somebody can drive you to the site, drop your team off, and then you can walk up the street rather than having to get in and out of a car over and over again. In those instances, we say that the residential inspections can typically be completed at a rate of around 20 to 35 per day for your walkable areas. Non-residential, your commercial buildings tend to be much larger, so about 3 to 15 per day for those. Areas with temporary or permanent access issues may require additional planning, and this doesn't just mean debris removal. If you have private lots or private subdivisions in your jurisdiction that are gated, make sure that you know the person that owns that subdivision or has access to that gate so that you can get on site to do your substantial damage inspections after a disaster. So make sure you know those individuals or know how to gain access to that property if you don't already. Also think about in times of flooding, a lot of times you have to wait for the water to recede before you can get out to that structure. If possible, assign your teams to areas with similar damages so they're not inspecting tornado damage at one point and flood damage at another. And then keep in mind to make sure everybody's on the same page about where you're regrouping at. Nobody should just go home once they're done. Everybody should report back to one place, turn in their paperwork, upload their pictures to a computer, make sure you know where you're going to do that and at what time. Make sure you didn't lose anybody in the process. Joel's asking, can we write on top of the interactive maps? Yes, you actually can. So we have a drawing tool. Um, if the interactive map is working, I'll check it when we get to the live demonstration. If the interactive map is working, I can show you the draw tool. You can actually draw on the interactive map, and then there's a print button. You can actually print the map as you're seeing it with your drawings into a PDF format, much like what I'm showing here on the right. Yeah, okay. Great question, though. Way to think about the resources that you have. Yep. Okay. So your pilot inspections. So when you have a team, again, make sure that the first set of inspections you're doing are done collectively as a group. So we say arrange for up to 3 pilot inspections. You can probably get away with 1 or 2, but ideally you're going to want to make sure everybody is seeing your process at the same time before you split off on your own. Try and do 1 residential and 1 non-residential structure if possible, but you don't have to. The idea here is just that everybody is seeing your process, and you need to be consistent across your team members. So make sure they're noting what they're taking pictures of. So what are you taking pictures of? Are you taking pictures of the water line, of the windows, of the roof? What are you taking pictures of, and how should I be taking my pictures? How to document the damages, so where you're actually writing the damages on, if you have a tablet or a piece of paper or what you're doing that recording system on, calculating your damage percentages for each element. And this is a big one that I don't know that gets talked about a ton, but make sure those individual team members know how to clearly communicate with property owners. And they should understand at the very basic level the floodplain management requirements that you have and the substantial damage process. This is the perfect time for a PR nightmare. This is the perfect time for you to send out your team and they start getting in arguments with people who are very upset that they have multiple people on their property, that they're telling them they can't rebuild, or that they're telling them they have to rebuild a certain way. These people, these team members, are an extension of you as the floodplain administrator. So make sure that they are acting professionally and are clearly communicating with these property owners what the expectations are, but are being sympathetic and having good bedside manner as they're walking through the area. We will talk about the substantial damage estimator tool as part of your field data processing in the next step. You're probably wondering, how do we come up with those damage percentages? Well, look no further than the handbook. Yet again, we have percentage damage tables in the handbook. for each structural element that has to be recorded as part of your substantial damage inspection. So your foundation, your superstructure, your exterior finish, your interior finish, your appliances, your HVAC, all will have individual rows like this. And then the ranges of percentages have descriptions of the damages you're looking for. And for all of these, the first one is specifically related to water level, but then the rest are not necessarily directly related to water level. So this is a good time to use these tables, first of all, in those pilot inspections to show where you're getting your percentages from, but also to review these ahead of time and to review how it applies to flood damage and also other types of damage as well. Now, we want you to use an exact percentage. So don't just use 25% or 0%. You can do 17%. You can do 18%. Those are just ranges that are recommended to be used. Use your best judgment. So at this point, and this is the first time I've used this word, but appeal. Property owners can appeal the decisions that you make, and that's okay. You, as the floodplain administrator, recognize that these individuals are hoping to start repairs as soon as physically possible, right? Which means that your process on the front end should be as efficient as possible. That means using your best judgment, not getting down to the individual dollar amounts, using your best judgment as the floodplain administrator to do your assessment as efficiently as possible to get them their determination, knowing that they can then appeal, and that's okay. Those damages are then recorded on inspection worksheets, and I'll show you the inspection worksheets that we have on the next slide. And again, be respectful to the property owners, but don't let them follow you around and influence the inspection. I helped a community do some substantial damage inspections last year, and this was a situation that we ran into. You just have to make sure you're not biased or swayed by the individual, because they will be coming by and telling you that window was broken last year already, or that AC unit hasn't worked in years. You have to do your assessment based on the current state of the property as unbiased as possible. So just keep that in mind. This is a screenshot of our substantial damage inspection worksheet. This is what you'll be filling out as part of your inspection. So you're going to note in the first part the structure information and the person doing the inspection. You're going to note how many pictures you took and what direction you were facing, the year the house was constructed and how it is built. So is it a residence or is it a townhouse? Is it one story or two or more stories? What's the foundation type? Is it stud framed or masonry or brick? Is the roof made of shingles or tile or slate? Is the exterior finish siding or brick veneer? Do they have an HVAC system? What's the current quality of the structure? And what was the cause of damage? So this is all the structural attributes. You'll fill all of this out here. And then you'll carry on to your element percentages. So your element percentages tie back to this table here. These element percentages tie into each of these that's listed on the worksheet. This is where you'll fill out 10%, 15%, 50%, and you'll work through. All of this information feeds directly into the substantial damage estimator 3.0. So you can take this worksheet back with you and plug in all of this information to the SDE 3.0, which then acts as a calculator and determines a percent damage based on the information that you plugged in. So this worksheet is your best friend. Make sure you have a ton of these printed out and ready to go in your office just in case. Again, these are all in the handbook. This is on page 65 of the handbook. This one is for residences, but there is also a commercial non-residential worksheet as well. So as you're doing this assessment, note the water lines, and this is kind of obvious if you have a flooding situation. This red arrow is pointing towards the water line on this property. So note your water lines, but make sure you're also taking pictures of damages to the roof, the foundation, the AC unit, windows, siding. Try to get the full story. And also it's really tempting to stay close to the structure and take pictures of individual walls and windows and doors, but make sure at some point you take a step back and take a picture of the entire building and look for any foundation shifting, a sagging roof line, things that you wouldn't necessarily notice by standing up close. And we also recommend that the first picture you take has the address on it. So, and what that will do is when you are, oh, is my voice fading out? Okay. I'll try to be more, I moved the microphone a little closer. Sorry about that. Okay. The, when you're taking your pictures, keep in mind that you're going to be taking probably dozens, maybe even hundreds of photographs, and you're going to lose track of what you're taking a picture of. And when you go back to your office and you upload these 300 pictures, you're going to lose track of which address you were taking a picture of. Is this picture for this house, or did they get messed up in my filing system in my camera? So what we recommend doing is the first picture you take a piece of paper or a note card or even the substantial damage worksheet and write the address on it and hold it up and take a picture with that address so that when you go to upload your pictures, they're separated out and you can chunk them together into individual files. It's just a good practice. This is a good example of where the front of the house maybe didn't look like it had a ton of damage. But then when you come to the back, you can clearly see that the basement or crawl space has been completely infiltrated and that the foundation system is compromised. So just an example of doing the full walk around. Now, ideally, your substantial damage assessment can be done without entering the house. You can do this entirely by walking around the house, around the property, and not having to enter into the structure. However, there may be some cases where you do. For example, let's say you do a substantial damage inspection, come to find out that the percentage is around 46%. You might ask that property owner if you can enter their home to do a more um, a more extensive review of the damages. And at that point, you can look for damages to cabinets, doorways, outlets, appliances, anything that would be interior to the structure that before you might have just been speculating on. In that case, first of all, talk to your legal counsel about your right of entry protections. What are you allowed to do? But also, um, if you really need written permission, you can use our right of entry certification and release. This is on page 51 of the handbook. You can print this off, and again, you can bring it with you during your curbside review or your inspection process. And what it is it's an agreement. It's an allowance by the property owner with their signature and your signature to allow you to enter into the property to complete your inspection. Now, if they deny you entry, that's okay. Just do your inspection from the outside and do the best that you can. So it's not the end of the world if they deny you permission. You can still complete your inspection. And we recommend starting your inspection entirely on the outside of the structure. It's less intrusive. Now, if you are entering a structure that's been damaged, use caution because, of course, there could be structural deficiencies or health concerns with that structure. So it might be a good idea to make sure that that structure is stabilized if need be, or just don't enter it at all. Okay, so that's the inspection process. Let me know if you have any questions about completing the substantial damage inspections. But the most important thing is that you have those worksheets printed off, ready to go, so that you can fill those out when you're doing your inspections. If you need links to the PDF versions of that, feel free to reach out to us. But they are in the handbook. You can scan those and make copies. So we were just about to talk about you've finished your substantial damage inspection and everybody's come back together as a group. And let's be honest, sometimes this takes multiple days. You might be doing step 3 for multiple days, maybe even a week or longer, depending on the number of structures you have to inspect. I know after 2019, we had a number of jurisdictions that were responsible for up to 1,000 substantial damage inspections. So just keep that in mind. So that step 3 might just be multiple days, but now you've collected all of that field data and now you're processing that field data. We recommend using FEMA's Substantial Damage Estimator 3.0. And if we have time, I'll open that up and show you what that looks like. But essentially, this is a calculator. It takes everything that you write down on that worksheet that we showed earlier. You can plug it into the substantial damage estimator. You make a property entry and you do an assessment in the substantial damage estimator, and it will spit out a percent damage calculation with a report that you can then print and attach to your floodplain development permit. This is a FEMA accepted piece of software that you can use as a part of your substantial damage assessment process. So we recommend using this. And again, the biggest thing is that you can create summary reports. So everything you plug in, you can print off a report at the end of it all and provide it to the property owner. And we'll cover this a bit more in detail. If we have time, I'll open it up and show you how it works. So that's plugging in the data. And what you're doing when you plug in that data is you're doing this calculation. You are comparing the cost to repair the structure to pre-damaged condition divided by the pre-damage market value of the structure, and then of course multiplying it by 100. So when you plug it all together, this is what that might look like. So if you have a $250,000 structure pre-damage, and it will cost $25,000 to bring that structure to its pre-damage condition, so back to its original condition, and you multiply that by 100, you come out to 10% damaged, so not substantially damaged. And it's that simple. However, of course, when you're plugging in all of those different element percentages, the roof, the siding, the interior finish, the flooring, that percentage can get relatively difficult. That repair cost can be hard to come up with unless you're using the substantial damage estimator tool. We highly recommend using that. But this is the calculation essentially that it's doing. Now, the thing about market value is that it can come from 3 different places. The first place that it can come from, and the first place it should come from, is the tax assessed value. Now, why do I say that? Well, again, you're going to have people lining up wanting to start repairs. You don't have time to wait to line up professional appraisals for every single structure in your floodplain to do your substantial damage assessment. So rather than waiting for those appraised values, use what you already have. Use the tax assessed value that's on your assessor's page to do your market value assessment, and that's allowed. FEMA allows tax assessed values to be market value. The other option is professional appraisals. Now, what we recommend for professional appraisals is that, again, those are not the first valuation that you do, but they are part of an appeal. So you do your initial assessment based on tax assessed value. And then if the property owner disagrees, they can hire an appraiser to get an appraised value and submit it as part of an appeal to your initial determination. The other option, and this is a little harder to do, but what you can do is take the cost per square foot and come up with an estimated value. Sorry. You come up with an estimated value. And what you're doing there, if you know the base cost in your area, so for example, say it costs around $150 per square foot to construct a new building in your community. You would take $150, multiply it by the square footage of the structure, and then take into account the depreciation rating and get an estimated value of the building. This might be better used for your manufactured homes or mobile homes where maybe they don't have a tax assessed value or the tax assessed value is extremely low. But again, if possible, use the tax assessed value first. The market value is defined as the price that the seller is willing to accept and the buyer would be willing to pay on an open market and in an arm's length transaction. Just coming up with the fairest price for the individual structure. Now, keep that in mind. We're talking about the structure's value, not the entire property, the individual structure's value. Now, cost to repair. Where does cost to repair come from? Well, that also can come from three places. The first and the fastest to obtain is using the substantial damage estimator tool. You plug in your worksheet information and the SDE 3.0 tool will calculate the cost to repair as a calculator. That's part of its function. You can do that on your own with the information that you obtain from the field. You don't have to wait for somebody to go out and do it for you. So this is the fastest to obtain. We recommend for anybody looking to get a contractor estimate to do repairs, that be part of an appeal. So they can appeal your cost to repair with a contractor estimate. But both forms are acceptable methods for cost to repair. The other option is an itemized list of materials and labor costs prepared by the property owner. Now, of course, you have to call into question some of the things they might put on there and make sure that it is still a reasonable assessment. The important thing here is that none of the work is free. It doesn't matter if they're doing it themselves or Jerry from down the street is helping them do it, or they had a group of volunteers help them do it. They have to account for the market, the going rate for market labor costs. So even if the work is being done for free, they still have to calculate labor costs. Now, cost to repair includes all of the work necessary to restore a damaged building to its pre-damaged condition. This includes all the materials, all of the labor, and all other items necessary to perform the proposed work. I've heard it a dozen, probably 100 times, where a property owner says, well, I'm not going to repair the entire house. I'm going to leave that room alone, or I'm not going to replace the cabinets, or I'm not going to replace the carpet. You have to do your calculation based on all of the work necessary to bring the structure back to pre-damaged condition, regardless of the actual work they're planning to do. So in those costs to repair, the market rate of materials and labor. This was an interesting situation. We heard of a property owner that was going to the local landfill and was collecting materials to help do part of their renovations. And they were claiming that their materials were free as part of their substantial improvement assessment. That is not true. You have to take the market rate of those materials if you were to go to your local hardware store and buy them, and the market rate for labor, even if that was volunteered. You also have to include demolition costs, the contractor's overhead and profit, any structural elements, including the exterior finish, flooring, cabinets, electrical and HVAC, plumbing, trim, etc., and your built-in appliances. Now, built-in appliances, the way we like to explain that is if you were to pick up the entire house and open up all the doors and shake it, all of the appliances that fall out are not built in. So that might be your washer and dryer, your your refrigerator, unless that happens to be built in. But typically your built-in appliances are going to be like your dishwasher would be a good example of a built-in appliance. Excluded costs for repair, so things that don't need to be included in that cost to repair estimate, would be like trash removal and general cleanup. So just cleaning up the property and getting rid of branches and gunk and muck. That stuff doesn't need to be calculated as part of the cost to repair. Any efforts to temporarily stabilize the structure doesn't need to be included. If there's a surveyor that needs to be involved or an engineer, those costs, those fees don't need to be included. If you charge permit fees or if an inspector is involved and they charge a fee, those fees don't need to be included. Your plug-in appliances don't need to be included. And if they had pre-existing health, safety, or sanitary code violations, they need to correct those, and those don't need to be included in your substantial damage assessment. The list of included and excluded costs, the entire list, can be found in the handbook on page 77, or sorry, page 49. Page 49 is the excluded and included cost guide for repair estimates. And so it lists out all of the included costs on page 1, and then you flip it to page 2, and it has all of the excluded costs. If a contractor is preparing a contractor estimate form as an appeal to your initial assessment from the SDA 3.0 tool, they should use the cost estimate form from the handbook as well. The cost estimate form is on page 77, and that requires them to put their license number and has a line item for every single piece that needs to be included in their cost estimate. And anything that they leave blank, you know to question them on. This ensures consistency, accuracy, and in the case of a legal event, defensibility. Okay, at this point, you're now going to issue your determination to the property owner. So you've compared the cost to repair to the market value, and you have your percentage. You now need to let them know what their percentage is. So you need to issue your determination to the property owner. First of all, print your summary report from the SDE 3.0 tool. And with that, include a letter with your official determination on your community's letterhead and explain if they were or were not substantially damaged. We have template letters in the handbook that you can use in your jurisdiction. We have one for flood-related substantial damage, flood-related non-substantial damage, and substantial damage for other events, not including flooding, so like a tornado or a wildfire. We have template letters for that you can use that includes all of the information that would need to be included. And I'll show you what that list is on the next slide. With that letter and that summary report, also make sure to staple a blank floodplain development permit application so they have one that they can return to you to start their repairs. Now, I want to point out that letter that you write indicating whether or not they were substantially damaged is required for them to qualify for ICC or mitigation funding. So that increased cost of compliance, that $30,000 we talked about before, they need this letter in order to get that. They need that from you. So this is an extremely important document, not just for your records, but also for theirs. Those determination letters should include the date of the event. That's important for insurance claims. Of course, their insurance adjuster is going to look at when they're making the claim for. So the date of the event, the percent damage, their market value, your contact information, the appeals procedures, because again, you're just going off at this point, the tax assessed value and the SDA 3.0 tool. So make sure they know how to appeal your determination and specifically use the term substantial damage. Make sure you're specifically using that. Again, all of this would be included in our template letters. The last step after you've processed your appeals, so you have, if somebody submits an appeal, make sure to process those. Look for on that permit application. So remember, you stapled that application. They've now returned it to you. Look on that permit application for any additional work being proposed. A lot of times people will take this opportunity to maybe redo the kitchen or remodel things. And in that case, that needs to be built into your cost estimate. That needs to be added to your substantial damage determination, because those are additional improvements being made. Even though that's outside of just bringing the structure back into or back to pre-damage condition, it's now an improvement, which constitutes a substantial improvement, which we'll talk about towards the end. If it is substantially damaged, check for proof that they recognize the need to bring the structure into compliance. So if they bring a floodplain development permit application back to you and they're saying they're not going to elevate the structure, that should raise red flags. You know that they were substantially damaged. Make sure that they have included some sort of information showing that they plan to elevate or mitigate the structure. That should be included with their permit application. Otherwise, you'll have to return it. When you get appeals to your cost estimates, double check the contractor license number to make sure it's still valid. Encourage or require second or third estimates. And those estimates can also be hired by you as a community to make sure that they're non-biased. If the property owner just flat out refuses to get other estimates, you can require that themselves and the contractor sign an affidavit certifying that their costs are accurate. And what that does is it just makes them put in writing that they haven't fudged any numbers, that their estimations are accurate to the best of their knowledge, which of course goes a long way in the event of a legal action being taken. Affidavits, and these are not necessarily in our handbook, but if you go to FEMA's desk reference, the P758 Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk Reference, there are example affidavits for both the contractor and property owner in that. And they're towards the end, there's some of the appendices. I read FEMA's P758 all the time, so I recommend that you do too. So if they flat out refuse to get other estimates, have them sign that affidavit. Those costs, again, should include all materials and labor, including demolition. I had an instance where somebody appealed a determination and chose to exclude demolition costs, so that had to be pushed back and they had to redo it. And again, costs must be based on current market rates. So another example, real world example, somebody had a structure that was damaged in 2019. They came back in 2024 proposing to do work based on the 2019 cost estimate. Things had to be adjusted to make sure they were based on current market rates. Okay. Remember to obtain proof of compliance upon completed construction. So after they've elevated their house, they need to have a surveyor come out post-construction, and this is likely months after the event. But once they've completed construction, they need to provide you with a surveyed elevation of the lowest floor to show that they are now compliant with your ordinance. If they are if they're a relocated or demolished structure, make sure you go do a site tour to make sure that that's happened. And if it's a flood-proofed structure, make sure they're providing engineering certificates. But the point is here, the initial permit to do repairs does not end the entire process. You then have to come in post-construction to make sure they followed your original permit. And that's the entire process. So again, all of these forms and templates you can download individually from our digital desk reference, and the worksheet templates, the interior inspection guide, exterior inspection guide, those percent damage estimation tables, the press release, all of this can be found under Substantial Damage Assessment Handbook forms and templates on our digital desk reference. Curbside review practice. What I want you to do here, I'm going to show some pictures of structures. And I want you to tell me, first of all, if you think that this structure requires a full walk around substantial damage inspection, And if it does, what you think the percent damage might be. And this is just the curbside review. We're not doing the full inspection. We're just getting a general understanding of the damages that might be in our community. So here, first of all, does this need a substantial damage inspection? And you can put in the chat or give a thumbs up or thumbs down. So seeing some differing answers. So in this case, actually the answer would be no. So um and this is important to differentiate because Amy brought up a good question. Is it in the floodplain? We don't, and we'll go with yes, all of these are going to be in the floodplain just for consistency for all these pictures, they are in the floodplain. In this case, what we know about it is that this is a post firm or compliant structure. This structure has already been elevated above an enclosure, which means that it's already compliant with your regulations. Okay, for the substantial damage inspection, yes or no? And if so, ballpark estimate of how much damage in terms of percentage you think these structures have incurred. Yeah. Yeah, so the one in the back there you can see probably is off its foundation. You can safely assume that that one's probably over 50%. Some of these maybe not so much. For the ones that are still on where it looks like maybe the skirting was just damaged. These would be a good example of one that you would have to come back and do a full inspection for. So at this point, we're just doing our drive-through. So we would make note that one of these structures is more than likely above 50%, but some of these we will have to do full inspections for. We're in that 25 to 50% range, so we need to do those full walk around inspections. And we can also take note, there's about 5 or 6 structures here that have incurred damages. We can tally those up, bring those back to the office, and help figure out about how long it's going to take to inspect this trailer park. We'll do a couple more and then we'll move on. How about for, and we're gonna look, let's look at the house on the right. So this yellow house. What do we think for this one, percentage wise? Yeah, I think we're in the about 10 to 25%, so we're on that lower end. And what that tells you is that, okay, we probably need to come out and do an inspection in this area. There looks like damage. However, we're probably not going to be at that substantial threshold. So this is one that we can send a team out to probably do relatively quickly and help them get a permit to start repairs pretty quickly. Pat is mentioning that you had a tornado that took a good part of your roof. That's true. We can't see the back of the roof, so maybe the back half of the roof is gone. We don't know without doing a full inspection, hence why you should still do an inspection. However, we're in that lower range more than likely. So this is an inspection we can do relatively quickly and help them get a permit to start repairs. And for this one, this will be the last one, and then we'll move forward for the sake of time. Yeah, so we're going to be on the very high percentage side now. We're very likely looking at substantial damage. In fact, we probably are looking at substantial damage. Keep in mind, we're not thinking about a percentage of how much of the structure is left. We're thinking about the valuation of the structure. So if we were to rebuild this structure back to pre-damaged condition, how much would it cost? And actually, you might even be looking at about 125% for a structure like this. It might just cost genuinely that much in current material rates and labor rates compared to its market value. That's, we have seen, I've done calculations that came out to 150%. That was something that we experienced last year when the tornado impacted Douglas County. So it's not entirely uncommon to actually get above 100% when you're comparing the cost to repair to the market value. So, but what this one tells you is that we still need to do a substantial damage determination, of course. They still need that paperwork. However, we can probably just take a few pictures of this one and move on. We don't need to come back out and do a full individual inspection. So that was a lot of information, and I know that. So let's think about some things that we can do now to get you ready for if or when this occurs in your jurisdiction. So knowing what you've learned, you can understand that at this point, the most important thing to do is, first of all, know your regulatory jurisdiction. So where is your floodplain and where are your community boundaries? And within your floodplain, how many structures do you have? Do you have 5, 10, 100? Figure that number out, tally that up now using our interactive map, and determine how many structures you might have to do a substantial damage estimation for. Then build a database. The nice thing about the SDE 3.0 tool is that you can build your database in that tool. You can add property entries and do your assessments later, so you have that database already built out. Also, and this is something you can do tomorrow, get in contact with your county or regional emergency manager. This is a person that you, as the floodplain administrator, should have at least a conversation with so they understand what your responsibilities are in a disaster situation. That way they can get you credentialed. So I have, and I don't have it with me, but I have an EOC card for Lincoln Lancaster County. But that's a card that you would need in order to scan in and out of a disaster site so they can clock your hours as the emergency manager. So if you want to get credentialed ahead of time, so you're not doing that the day of, talk to your emergency manager, just get in contact with them tomorrow, make sure they know who you are, and they can issue you an ID card. And even better, they might be able to build you into their incident command system. And then, of course, make a plan. You can make a plan for this ahead of time, identifying how many volunteers you might need, who those volunteers might be. Do we need clipboards, pens, hard hats? Do I need an ID badge to bring with me? Do I need to print off some business cards? Come up with a plan and start getting ready for this ahead of time. So you can use our interactive map or the Map Service Center to identify your floodplain boundaries and have a look at how many structures you have in your jurisdiction's floodplain. Our interactive map is on our website, and Michelle has put a link to that in the chat. So here's our interactive map. Again, it's on our website. You can just search any community. I'll just because it just came to mind right away. Utan, Nebraska, in Saunders County. What I recommend you doing is the first thing is to come up to the layers tab, which is these three boxes on top of one another, and turn on your community boundaries. This will give you that yellow boundary so you can see where your jurisdiction limits are and have a look at how many structures you have in your floodplain. And you can start tallying up those addresses so that you know and are ready for that event when it occurs. If you have any questions about the functionality of our interactive map, feel free to just reach out. Someone had asked earlier about the drawing tool. Up here next to the search bar, you have this easel, this art easel. Feel free to click on that and it will pull up your drawing window. You can make pins. So if I click this, I can select what I want my pins to look like, or I can do flags. We can do green flags. And if you're doing this process, that's a green flag. But I can just now click around on those individual structures and make those notes. If you want to make different shapes, you can click on different shapes and choose your colors. So maybe I want to do, a yellow polygon for this subdivision for one reason or another. So I can just click, click and hold, and it's going to make a box. You can write text. So now if I want to add a label, I can put in this text box. I can just, call it subdivision. And now when I click, it now labels that box. And the last thing I can do is I can click this print map. And this might take a moment just because I have the Zoom open. But if you click this button that looks like a printer, and then you can adjust this window where you want it to go. And it'll generate a PDF of the map that you've just created. So if you need to present to your community's leadership at a board meeting, or maybe you're having a town hall after a disaster and you're trying to show your floodplain boundaries, rather than unraveling your massive firm panels, which you can do, but rather than doing that, you can come to the interactive map and generate these smaller size prints instead. So I'll show you what this looks like here. And there's everything that I just drew and the yellow box and the floodplain, along with a legend. Okay, so before a disaster, take time to identify your structures in the floodplain and create that inventory. Now, this is something we can help with. So if you need that list, or if you want us to help you develop that list, get in contact with us. Give us about 2 weeks or so to get that done. But we can create and we have a building footprint layer that we can use to create a list of properties that are in your floodplain. We'll make sure to remove any personally identifiable information on that. So it's just a list of addresses. So you'll have to go in and maybe make some edits, but we can provide you with that list in a format that can be uploaded to the STE 3.0 tool to help you build your database. I've got some slides here on how you can do it yourself using your assessors page, but using the assessors page, you can get a list of property information. If you just click and hold on each of those individual parcels, it'll pull up all of the information. That's another way that you can create a property database. So if you're interested in doing it on your own, feel free to read through the PowerPoint and you can follow the process in here. We also have a training on how to do it on the SDE 3.0 tool on our website that's pre-recorded. So I'll move through here. The next thing I want to do is I want to open up the substantial damage estimator tool. Okay, so this is what it looks like here. If you are working with us and we provide you with that database to upload, what you can do is use this import export function to do a mass import. So if we provide you with a database that we've pre-created, you can mass import using this green button here. Or you can do individual property additions. So if I click add new property, It's going to pull up this screen, and I can just, the very first thing you should do is click save. What that's going to do is it's going to pull up all of these push pins, and those tell you what is required and what's not required as part of your entry. So I can put myself for the name and my street number and name, and I am on a street, oops, in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it was built in 1925. It turned 100 this year. And notice that the red push pin is for the structure type. So you have to mark this in order to make an entry. And now I'll go ahead and I'll click save. Property was saved successfully. Now what I can do is I've made that entry. So you can see total number of properties is 2. I had entered one in yesterday for a different reason. But that you can see it'll start tracking all of those properties you add in, and now you have a database already set up, ready to go if you have a disaster event. When you fill out your worksheet and come back to your office to plug it into the SDA 3.0 tool, you're going to click Add New Residential Assessment or Add New Non-Residential Assessment, depending on what it is. I'm going to click Add New Residential Assessment. And here are the 2 properties I have. I'm going to click on mine, the one that I just entered, and I'm going to click Use Selected Property. And it'll take a moment to load from here, but this is going to load that calculator I talked about for doing your assessment. You can see how this would be a somewhat painful process if you're doing it in a disaster situation. So it's important to try and get this done ahead of time. Maybe hire some interns if you have a local internship program or a local college with someone interested in learning about community government. I would have had a blast doing this as a college student, and you can put it on your resume. So anyway, it's going to have all of these structures information. We'll go ahead and move on from here. This again lines up with that worksheet. So you can put in how many stories it is. So it's a 1-story structure, single family residence. I'm built on a crawl space, stud framed, shingles, siding. Yes, we have HVAC. I would say it's average condition. And I'll go ahead and move on. I'll click save here. So I get my push pins. There it goes. Okay, now we go to cost. This is where we're going to calculate the cost of the structure itself. Now, I could use the tax assessed value, or I can calculate it based on the base cost. So let's say in Lincoln, it costs about $150 per square foot to build a structure. This geographic adjustment, just put a 1. It's a multiplier. So in terms of my home, you can use these calculators or you can just enter the square footage manually. My house is about 720 square foot. So I'll enter that manually and click save and close. So at $150 multiplied by 720 square feet, it comes out to about 108,000 for the replacement cost. But then you have to put a depreciation rating. I would say my home is, again, an average condition, so it comes out to a computed cash value of $81,000. This is an acceptable market value. You can use this, or you can use the tax assessed value, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Here is where you would plug in all your element percentages. So let's say we just had a windstorm and my roof covering was damaged about 50%, and that's it. Everything else is fine, just for the sake of time. So I put 50% for roof covering. Remember those damage assessment tables. That's where you would get these percentages from. When I click save, it now has my percentage. So it has calculated me at 2.8% damaged. And that's it. That's done. I can now print the summary report, and it's going to create a printable PDF With this assessment and the percent damage already on it, I can sign at the bottom, staple it to a blank floodplain development permit, and provide it to the property owner. If you want to use the tax assessed value in this tax factor adjustment, just put in the market value. So let's say my home is tax assessed at 150,000, which it is not, but we'll just say it is. And oops, sorry, I put that in the wrong box. This one. And you do have to put a multiplier there. So it's just a 1. And then in this checkbox, you mark adjusted tax assessed value instead of computed cash value. And it will adjust that assessment accordingly. So now my percent damage is 1.5 instead of 2.8. Same if you get appeals. So if you do a market appraisal or contractor estimate, just click the different checkbox and enter in that information, and it will adjust your assessment. We have a full training on the SDA 3.0 tool on our website, so feel free to reference that if you want a full tutorial. Okay, so moving on, communication. So in terms of preparing ahead of time, make sure you're garnering support now from your community leadership and have these tough conversations ahead of a major disaster. Make sure they're on the same page as you. You can do pre-event activities, so you can attend these trainings annually, host a public meeting about substantial damage and fish for some potential mitigation options, do public outreach projects, have handouts, or just review your floodplain development regulations and see if they need updating. There is a template substantial damage management plan that you can reference. It's specifically designed for CRS communities, but you, even if you're not a CRS community, can use it as a template to design a substantial damage management plan locally. And the nice thing is you don't have to follow it line by line unless you're a CRS community, which is the community rating system, by the way. The best way to fight misinformation during a disaster is to make sure you have clear, transparent planning processes before one occurs. So identifying your at-risk structures, developing outreach strategies, garnering support from leadership, and having mitigation projects in mind. So when you receive disaster funding and mitigation funding, you know which properties are interested. Substantial improvement. And what does that relate to substantial damage? Well, substantial improvement kind of is the same concept. It's also a grandfathering threshold. But this applies to any time you're doing additions or improvements to an existing structure that may not necessarily be related to actual damage. This is just somebody proposing to add an attached garage, finish their basement, replace their roof. These would all be considered improvements. So a substantial improvement is any reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvement where the cost exceeds 50% of the market value before the start of construction. Now, this includes substantial damage. So what that means is if you have substantial improvement and substantial damage, the costs of both have to be included. So if somebody is proposing to do repair work and also finish their basement, those costs have to be included together. Just keep in mind that these improvements are often proposed at the same time of damage repair or shortly after. So watch for phased improvements, watch for phased projects where they're only asking for a permit for part of the project and then come in a year later to finish it. Make sure they're giving you the full scope of work on the front end and make sure they're including all of the costs that are required to be included. Again, we've got the included and excluded cost guide and our contractor estimate form in our handbook. So use those, lean on those. We've already talked about the excluded cost list. Now your record keeping, what do you need to maintain? Permits related to floodplain management have to be maintained in perpetuity. That's important for a number of reasons, but the biggest is for NFIP compliance. If somebody is coming in and verifying if a structure has been built in compliance with your floodplain regulations, they need to be able to find the paperwork related to that. And don't just think about it 10 or 15 years from now. Think about it maybe even 30 years, 50 years from now. If you don't have an event within that time frame, and you suddenly do have an event, and supposedly the structure is built in compliance, you should have the paperwork to back that up and show it. Otherwise, it'll have to be reobtained, new surveys, new engineering documents, what have you. So floodplain development permit documents should be maintained in perpetuity. This especially includes your SI, substantial improvement, substantial damage. So this would be your building inspection records. If it's a historic structure, maintaining their status. If there's any variance proceedings, meeting minutes, other supporting documentation. If it's related to floodplain management, related to the floodplain development permit, maintain it in perpetuity. In the handbook, also, we include field data processing tips and tricks, those determination letters, maintaining integrity as you're doing your determinations, additional permitting considerations, if you're doing repairs to major infrastructure, violations, and guidance for site inspections. Again, all is located in the handbook. And again, FEMA's desk reference for substantial improvement and substantial damage is one that I reference all the time, and I recommend you do too. There's also the answers to questions about substantially improved, substantially damaged buildings, which I also reference all the time. It's an FAQ, frequently asked questions, and FEMA does a great job of breaking down the answers to those questions. That's FEMA 213, and Michelle has put links to both of those. The substantial damage estimator does have guides, so you can reference those if you're trying to learn how to use the substantial damage estimator. We have a new quick guide for when you're doing your curbside review or your site inspections. We have it on a format that doesn't get damaged by weather. I don't remember what the material is called, but you can't even tear it with your teeth. It's a very durable material, so you can bring it out with you in the field. And it includes some handy diagrams like what's shown on the right there for the different structural elements to look for. This is our list of social medias. So if you want to follow us on social media, again, we are doing a severe weather awareness week campaign that Isabella Bialis is heading that campaign for this week. So she's putting out some wonderful posts for the rest of this week. If you'd like to check those out. And then this is all of our contact information. Feel free to reach out to anybody on our team for any questions. Erin, Anna, Mercy, and Isabella are all CFMs now, so I need to update this screen. So I apologize for that, but yes, feel free to reach out to any one of us.